the chasm between what people are earning and what it costs to have a place to live is by no means unique to New York and LA and San Francisco. There is no city or county in the entire United States of America where someone earning the local minimum wage can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. And I argue that the sprawling tent encampments that we see driving around LA or San Francisco are only the tip of the iceberg of this far deeper catastrophe.
Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today I am thrilled to welcome to the podcast Brian Goldstone. Brian is a journalist and the author of a brand new book that came out last month called There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. The book explores the world of the working homeless, people who are employed full-time but still unable to afford permanent housing, by following 5 families in Atlanta. Today, Brian and I talk about how he found and approached the families to cover in this book, how America got to a place where housing became so unaffordable, and what he thinks can be done about it. Don't forget, our book club pick for April is Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton. Tiana Clark will be back on Wednesday, April 30th, to discuss the book with us, so make sure you read along and tune in. Quick reminder, everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks can be found in the link in the show notes. If you're listening to the show, if you love this show, if you want to support the work of this show, head to patreon.com/thestacks and join our bookish community, also known as the Stacks Pack, or check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com, where I give you some exciting perks and a lot of hot takes. Joining these communities is the perfect way to support the work of the Stacks and make sure you get this podcast in your ear every single Wednesday. Okay, y'all, that does it for us today. Now it's time for my conversation with Brian Goldstone. Okay, everybody, welcome to The Stacks. Brian Goldstone, author of There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. Brian, welcome to The Stacks.
Hi, Tracy. It's so good to be with you.
I'm so happy to have you. I'm so excited. I think when I reached out to your team to have them send me this book at the end of last year, I said, please send this book. I think it was built in a lab specifically for me. It is... I'll let you tell the people what it's about, but for those of you who love the kind of nonfiction that I love, narrative, embedded with people, deep dive into systems that are fucked up, There Is No Place for Us is our book. So Brian, in about 30 seconds or so, will you tell people about this book?
Yeah, so the book follows 5 families in Atlanta who are part of a growing but largely hidden crisis, the dramatic rise of the working homeless in cities across the country. And these are people with full-time jobs, Uber drivers, janitors, warehouse workers, whose paychecks simply are not enough to secure stable housing for themselves and their kids. And so by following these families' journeys over a period of about 2 years in the book, it shows how this toxic mix of skyrocketing rents, low wages, a lack of tenant rights, along with forces like gentrification and racialized displacement, are just driving more and more people into homelessness in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word harrowing gets used too much to describe books. Like, I think they throw it on anything. Not this one. That was the only word I could think of as I was reading it. It's such an intense experience for the reader, which only leads me to believe it's an even more intense experience for the people who are living it. I'm curious, when did you become familiar with this group of people, this working homeless, and what was it about, specifically working homeless as opposed to, I guess, like broadly unemployed homeless that was inspiring enough for you to want to write about it?
So the genesis of the book was I think in 2018, my wife is a nurse practitioner and she was working at a community health center in Atlanta where we live. And she was just struck by the number of patients she was seeing at this community health center, people who didn't have insurance, that's why they were there, but who were working at Walmart or,
Mm.
driving for DoorDash or Lyft, or working at McDonald's or any number of other jobs. And at the end of their shifts, they were going not to an apartment, but sleeping in their car or even in a homeless shelter, in one case on the street. And she was stunned by like this trend that she was seeing. And when she told me about it, I was pretty stunned. I had been
Mm.
reporting on, things usually really difficult things in different parts of the world. But this was happening in my own city, my own backyard. And so that was kind of the initial
Mhm.
question of like, is this some bizarre anomaly or is this pervasive? And if so, like how pervasive and why? So I ended up writing a magazine piece for the New Republic. I reported that over the course of about 7 months. So it was pretty deep into this one family's experience. And it was in the course of reporting that story that, on the one hand, like I just realized there was so much more to say and investigate, and so many systems interlocking to make this crisis, this phenomenon possible. And
Mm.
I also realized that I was just like, I was meeting all these people in the course of reporting that, not just caseworkers and church volunteers and, social workers and housing activists, but also like individuals and families who were also experiencing homelessness while
Right.
working in the labor force. And so
Right.
it kind of as organically as I think a book can emerge, it sort of emerged in that way out of that reporting.
Yeah. For people who are listening to this, and as I was reading the book, I was confronting a lot of my own notions of homelessness and who is homeless and what it means to be homeless. And I'm wondering if you can. This is in the book for sure, but I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit to the audience, like who is considered homeless and who is counted as homeless, because those are sort of two things. It turns out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a huge impetus for for writing the book, was my own astonishment at how there's this kind of like received or prevailing narrative about what homelessness is, what causes it, who is homeless, and then the reality that I was confronting in my research and reporting. And yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to believe or to remember that mass homelessness in America is like a relatively recent thing. It emerged in the 1980s, as many of America's maladies did under the Reagan
Shout
administration.
out
And
to Ronald
yeah,
Reagan.
he
Thank
always
you for your
manages to make an
service.
appearance in these
Yeah.
conversations.
You have a
Um,
whole chunk on him in this book, like towards the end, like where you sort of go into detail about what you're going to talk about right now. And
yeah,
I had just read that Reagan biography, and I was like, this isn't in the biography, weirdly. I wonder why not.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the Reagan administration made a concerted attempt, as more and more people around the country were being forced out of their homes, to shape the public perception and sort of story that America told about this emerging crisis. And that basically, I mean, at first they tried gaslighting the country and saying it's not actually happening. Like, one of Reagan's deputies actually said there are no people on the street, and people like everyone else had to just look outside their windows and see that
Right.
was a lie. But so once like denying the reality became impossible, they began to kind of shape the perception, and it boiled down to like making people believe that homelessness was the product of mental illness, untreated mental illness, and addiction, alcoholism, these kind of personal pathologies, these individual pathologies. And they actually, like, as we're seeing today under the current administration, researchers who wanted to study the effects of, say, like racist housing policy on this growing population of homeless Americans were not funded. There was
Hmm.
even an article I think it was in Time magazine, and it was Reagan versus the social sciences. So, like, there was this very deliberate effort to make the general public believe that this emergency that was like was not a product of deliberate policy choices, that it was like these individual failings. And what that neglected was the fact that even at that time, the fastest growing segment of the total homeless population were children under the age of 6. So
Mm.
like from the very beginning, the rhetoric and mythology did not match the reality. And but most Americans bought into the myth and the
Right.
sensationalist media accounts. And by the end of the 80s, a New York Times poll asked people like, what causes homelessness? And the number one answer was like psychological problems. And then after that, it was laziness and like a
Mm.
refusal to work.
And
So
what wasn't
yeah,
on the list? Because that's what I thought was really interesting. What was
what
not the answer that
what
people gave?
what not a single person answered with was housing. So like astonishingly, housing from the very beginning of the emergence of mass homelessness in America over the last 4 decades, like housing strangely was like missing from that conversation.
I mean, and that is clearly a win for Reagan, right? That he was able to to be the person who started mass homelessness and then not even have it connected to housing or like housing crises at all. I think that's like for his
Or
camp, they would say
yeah,
a win.
yeah, or to like his administration's
Yeah.
decimation of the social
Yeah.
safety net, housing being a really important part of that.
Right.
The stripping away of funding for public housing, of rental assistance. So like, and to get to another part of the question you were originally asking, like about the kind of invisibility of this. At that time, it wasn't just shaping the perception. When you can narrow the kind of characteristics of those experiencing homelessness down to this, down to alcoholism, addiction, mental illness, you can exclude everyone who doesn't fit into that. And
Right.
over the years, like an actual definition of homelessness materialized where, and they call it literal homelessness, that this definition determines who gets counted every year during the federal homeless census. And so, like, all of the families I write about in this book are not counted in the census that is given to us every year as the public, like, here's how many people are homeless in America.
And
And it's
that's
a, yeah,
because the people who are literal homeless have to either be living on the street or
mhm,
in a shelter.
that's right.
And so the people in your book are, because they're working and they have some income, they are able to pay for these extended stay hotels. So a lot of people end up there. Other people end up staying in an extra living room or on a couch or on a floor in family members' houses. And so those people who find those kinds of housing are not considered homeless in the eyes of the homelessness census, even though they do not have their own place to live. And also rooming houses are the other kind of third
Yeah,
place that people end up in the book.
yeah, totally. I mean, there's like this whole array of temporary situations that people cycle in and out of. A lot of even the people I followed in the book, they are in their car at one moment, they're trying to get into a shelter the next. There are no shelter beds available, or in one case, like the shelter says, yeah, you can come, but your 14-year-old son has to go to a men's shelter by himself because we don't allow boys over the age of 13 in our shelter. So like, so they don't go to the shelter and they end up
Right.
spending the entirety of their weekly and monthly income at this squalid extended stay hotel. But they're always very temporary, and yeah, they're all kind of sites or spaces of homelessness, but
Yeah.
only a very, very narrow sliver of those experiencing homelessness in America are counted. Like the families I write about, like literally don't count. They're
Yeah.
literally written out of the story.
Yeah. And there's another thing you cite about counting in schools, like that some school districts or schools count differently. They count kids who live in extended stays, and that the number of like children, just the children far exceeds the total number of homeless people according to this census, which I thought was just like, oh, okay, well, this data is
Yeah,
not matching. It was like 300,000 kids and then like 10,000 homeless people.
absolutely, absolutely. And the federal Department of Education does count families living in hotels or living temporarily with others in these kind of precarious situations. They do count them as homeless, but the Department of Education does not control and determine the allocation of resources for homeless
Right,
assistance, right?
right.
So that's HUD. That's like, so you have two federal agencies, HUD on the one hand and the Department of Education on the other, but one of them determines who gets help. And the other one, I mean, it's important that the Department of Education data exists because it
Right.
shows how misleading like HUD's numbers are.
Right.
But, as we're speaking right now, the Department of Education is in the process of being
Defunded.
defunded and dismantled. And it's so crucial that that not happen because if
Mm-hmm.
it does, we'll lose even this kind of minimal data that exists on children and students who are homeless in America.
Yeah. I want to shift a little and talk about how you came to putting together this specific book that we have here. I know you live in Atlanta. Is that the reason you picked Atlanta? Is Atlanta representative of something as a whole for the United States? Is it unique in certain ways? Like, why Atlanta?
Part of the answer to why Atlanta is that so much of the reporting on America's housing crisis and homelessness crisis tends to center on like a predictable set of like coastal cities, LA, San Francisco, New York. And I think a lot of people living in the rest of the country know that this crisis is way more pervasive and yeah, extensive like in where they live, but it's just not in the coverage. So like the first reason to focus it in Atlanta is just that I think Atlanta actually is representative in many ways of what any number of other cities in America, Austin, Nashville, Charlotte, Phoenix, San Jose. There's a whole range of cities that aren't typically in that discussion that are, I would argue, trending in the direction
Mm,
of what LA is seeing or what New York is seeing with these astronomical rates of unsheltered homelessness. But Atlanta is also unique in a lot of ways. Like Atlanta, for over 100 years, has been kind of a laboratory for housing policy in America. So, like, Atlanta was the first city in the nation to build public housing during the New Deal kind of progressive era. And Atlanta was then, during the 1990s and early 2000s, the first city in America to destroy all of its public housing intentionally in favor of kind of leaving low income tenants, letting them fend for themselves on the private market and giving, you know, subsidizing basically landlords to take care of the housing needs of the most vulnerable people in the city. So Atlanta has also kind of been in the vanguard of
mm,
of housing policy. I think most importantly, though, it is representative. Like the
yeah.
trends that I'm documenting are not in any way unique to Atlanta.
You mentioned that some of those other cities are sort of trending to have more homelessness or like ramping up this group of people. What are the predictors of that? What are you looking at to see that a city is headed in that direction, or a city is maybe like headed in a more housing direction? Is that even a thing that's happening right now? Like, is there any positive cities doing good things?
Maybe we can return to the question of hope because
Okay, we will return to that
that
because I have some questions about that at the end. We will let's
yeah
stick with
I
the dark and dreary for now,
yeah
and then
let,
I'll let you kind of make us feel a little better maybe at the end. But yeah, what are the predictors? I know you talk about rent gap as something in the book.
yeah I I mean the chasm between what people are earning and what it costs to have a place to live is by no means unique to New York and LA and San Francisco. So like the rents in New York are notoriously wild, but the wages also are relatively higher in those cities, or in that city, or in LA where the minimum wage is higher. In Atlanta, the minimum wage is still 7.25, which is the federal
Mm.
minimum wage. And as the National Low Income Housing Coalition points out in a report, there is no city or county in the entire United States of America where someone earning the local minimum wage, so which again is like sometimes higher than the federal minimum wage, where they can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. So like that phenomenon it's a nationwide phenomenon. This is
Yeah.
not specific to a handful of cities. And I argue that the sprawling tent encampments that we see driving around LA or San Francisco are only the tip of the iceberg, that it's
Hmm.
only the most kind of conspicuous edge of this far deeper catastrophe. And it's everything below the water surface, so to speak, that like that's happening everywhere in the country.
Right.
That's what we don't see it because they're in these hotels and they are doubled or tripled up with other people, but that is what's under the water surface. And like the more it comes out, the more it becomes conspicuous, the more people become aware of it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right. Right. How did you pick the families you were going to follow? How did you start with one and kind of build from there? Did you start with 20 and whittle your way down? Just like how does a book like how do you decide who's worth your time and focus?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very hard and complicated process because I mean, it was less a question, I think, of like who is worthy of my time and focus and um who is going to allow me into
Mm,
their lives in such a way that like the depth and texture of what it's like to be deprived of this most basic need is felt by readers. I knew that would require a kind of engagement that is not easy to come by. And so for some of the families, like I met them, I kind of immersed myself at this extended stay hotel called Efficiency Lodge, and I was just there a lot. I was just hanging out there a lot. I met dozens of families there, and there were a few who both kind of gravitated toward me or I gravitated toward them, and some of them ended up being in the book. They ended up being kind of prominent in the book. There were others who I tracked with for weeks or even months, and then it just became clear for different reasons that they weren't going to be featured as prominently, even if their stories. There were definitely cases where like people's stories were really dramatic and on paper, like their story exemplified a trend or made a certain argument that seemed important, but like there's so much more that is necessary to do this kind of reporting over,
mhm.
where you're not just dropping in and getting the story, but it's a long process of cultivating a relationship in both directions. So even though the superficial aspects were important, like we ended up just either tacitly or explicitly saying like, yeah, we're gonna stay in each other's lives, but it's not gonna be in the book.
Can you give an example of like without like getting anyone in trouble or anything of like what would cause you to decide against someone being a good fit or them to decide you're a good fit or whatever?
I think the most common, because it happened several times. I mean, it's kind of mind blowing to look back at these, past 5, 6 years and realize like how many people I have hours and hours and hours of recordings with them, hours and hours like going around with them to food pantries or to various places, and they make no appearance at all in the book.
Mm,
Um and in most of those situations, it was because what they were going through was so intense and so acute that they simply did not have space in their life
I see.
for anything else. And as much as I would like to believe that I was just kind of there in this kind of unobtrusive way, I know
Mhm.
that wasn't the case. And like I was asking a zillion questions, and
Right.
what did he mean by that? And they just didn't have space for that in their life right there. And that's
That makes
absolutely
sense.
understandable. Yeah.
Yeah. And then this might be a stupid question. I do believe there are such thing as stupid questions, but this is really just a nosy question. You, Brian, you walk up to the Efficiency Lodge and you go, "Hi, I'm Brian Goldstone. I'm going to write a book about you people. Um, anyone want to talk to me?" Like, what is the initial? You don't know anybody. What
Yeah.
is it? A handshake? Is it I'm a journalist? Is it hey? Want to
So,
talk? Like, it just feels so hard.
so with Efficiency Lodge, I showed up with Little Caesars.
Okay. Pizza,
That
pizza.
was my entree into. I came with pizzas. I actually live not that far from this road, Candler Road, where there's I think over 10 extended stay hotels just lining this road. I live not too far from there, and one night, this is before the pandemic, I got a call from a woman who runs like a homeless outreach at her church in Southwest Atlanta. And she was one of many people who I had kind of like cultivated a relationship with, like, what are you seeing out there? If you know of people who might be willing to share their stories, let me know. This was right at like the very, very early stages of reporting the book. And she called me one night and said, there's a family who just ended up at this hotel. I was supposed to bring them food because they don't have any money. They don't have any food. Would you mind bringing them something? I'm not able to get over there. And this was at like 11 o'clock one night. And I was like, okay, sure. And I stopped at Little Caesars and got, I don't know, like four pizzas, because it was a mom and her her three children. And her name is Michelle. She ends up being a central person in the book. I called Michelle when I parked outside, and like in the parking lot, and she ran down to meet me. And she said, I didn't want you to come up to the room because it's like too scary here at night. And so that was my first
Got it.
encounter with this hotel. And after, I think it was actually the next day, she said, "Can you bring me? I need these like personal items and um, toothpaste. Would you mind? Is there any way you could bring that stuff tomorrow?" And so I did, and it was daytime, and I met the manager of the hotel. I just introduced myself, and then I went back the next day and the next day, and I don't know. It
Got it.
just kind of happened that way.
Got it. So you didn't just like roll up, just like, "Hello." Like you had like a reason to go there that first day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. This brings me to the question that you've listened to the show. You've probably heard me ask this question of journalists who do this kind of work. It's the, question of ethics. It's the ethical question about following people. In this case, I mean, in your acknowledgments or in your notes at the end, you mention that you did buy meals for people throughout the process of like the research and the gathering information. And then it wasn't until after you had finished that you sort of had a more financial relationship with the people that you followed. So like while you were reporting, you might take them out for coffee, you might grab a bite to eat, but you weren't paying bills or anything like that. And then after you said that you were more financially involved. I'm wondering about like not even the ethics of it like for a journalist, but like what does it feel like for you, Brian, to be standing next to a woman and her three kids and being like, all I can do is buy you a coffee when you could conceivably do more? Like how is that how does that work? Because I feels like it would be hard.
It's incredibly hard. Uh, any reporter, researcher, journalist who is writing about people who are struggling in this way, in very basic material ways, and they're not kept up at night by this question, I think is really suspect. And so it's very, very hard. I did try to have ground rules going into this that I adhered to. I'm not. I can't give you like large sums of money if you're facing the possibility of being evicted from this hotel room. I can't give you $300 $400 to to prevent that from happening. One way that I navigated this tension was there's a woman in the book, L.A. Pink, who I think when readers encounter her in the book, there's kind of a sigh of relief. It's like
Yes.
she's a really powerful presence, and whatever readers feel when they encounter her in the narrative, like I certainly felt in real life,
Mm,
because she was someone who I was able to sort of like be with her as I was with many of these families. And when situations arose that were more, I don't know, like when there was a very obvious pointed need, she was often the one who was able to draw on the resources that she had and like help them out in that way. And she was also able to exercise like the judgment of what do I do in this moment. It's
mhm.
often hard to know, uh, do you give the money, how much money do you give, etc. So she was the one sort of struggling with some of that. It's not to say that I was like offloading all of this tension and all of this responsibility onto her, but it definitely helped to have someone who was just there with me most of the time and
Mhm.
was like willing to intervene actively. But having said that, yeah, it's uh, I think Andrea Elliott, when she was on the show, she spoke really eloquently about the arbitrariness of a lot of the rules that we
Yeah.
come in with, and yeah, the idea that you can take someone out to eat, but you can't give them money for someone who's hungry. Like taking them out to eat is just as transactional. So
Yeah.
and often it's not even money or food, it's like knowledge, it's knowing how to navigate systems, things that
Right.
as a journalist or a scholar or someone who has spent time understanding how these systems work, that knowledge becomes very valuable, or it could be very valuable to people. And knowing how much, like as someone is trying to get assistance to avoid being on the street with their kids, how much of that information do you give them as someone who has like acquired it? That was
And
something
how much could you give of that information?
um I mostly erred on the side of like sharing what I knew.
Mhm.
And there were a couple of situations, those families I was alluding to earlier in our conversation, who I ended up not including in the book, who where like I was instrumental in connecting them with an organization or a case manager who was able to get them the help they needed, and
Mm.
they were able to find a degree of stability as a result. And I just realized that my action had become so decisive that
Couldn't
yeah,
use it in
yeah,
the book.
yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah.
makes
And that
sense.
was a conscious decision on my part. Like
Yeah.
I mean, that was pretty clear cut, and there really weren't that many moments with those who and I ended up following in the book who where that came up as explicitly.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books, duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Okay, we're back. As far as like the rules that you put in place for yourself, were they like very specific, like no more than $100, or was it like, how did you know what was too much and to help, and how did you communicate those rules to the families if they were asking for help? Did they ask for help?
With everyone who I ended up writing about, and even those who I didn't, who I just spent a lot of time with thinking I might write about them, I was constantly trying to remind them that, like, why I was there, that I was there to ultimately write a book about their experience. It felt important to do that for reasons of consent, that just because they told me at the very beginning of this process, 2 years ago, that they were okay with me tracking with them. Like, I wanted them to remember that, even though in their eyes, I think I was often just like their support system. Like, I was the guy who they called at 1 a.m. to just unload their feelings. And so I was constantly reminding them. And part of that was also saying, like, here is why I am tracking with you, because people need to see what it's like to go through what you're going through. And they felt that too. Nobody in the book didn't want their story told, or didn't feel very strongly like, I want the world to know what this feels like. And so it was kind of just together. It wasn't this authoritarian kind of rule, like, I won't do this for you.
Right.
I'm not going to help you. It was like, how can we make this as real as possible? We're not acting here. We're not like doing some kind of performance where I'm going to be manipulating things behind the scenes, and then I'm going to pretend that's not the case. I just have to be showing what it's like. And I think they got that in an intuitive way. If I could just speak to that a little more, like the question of helping them or intervening, I think it ultimately, the hardest thing for me was not, do I give $100 right now, or do I spend the money on this food right now, or whatever. The hardest thing for me in this whole process was, I really tried to cultivate from the very beginning what I would describe as kind of like this radical availability to them. That this comes out of my training as an anthropologist, my background as an ethnographer.
I was going to ask about this because, as you know, we had Jason De Leon on the podcast, and in his book, he's radically available as well.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of what ethnography is about is you go in with as few boundaries as you possibly can have. Not necessarily ethical boundaries, but boundaries in terms of like when the reporting begins and when it ends. And ideally, you don't know necessarily what the story is until you discover it, and you don't have an argument until you discover it. And so I needed to let the people I was writing about know that I was just there as much as humanly possible for whatever they needed in terms of like you need a ride somewhere, you need to talk to someone in the middle of the night, you need me to take you to the ER, as I did in one case. Uh, like whatever it is, I'm going to be there. And mostly that was emotional because the very nature of being without housing in this way has a lot to do with not having much of a network to rely on,
Yeah.
right? And I was able to provide some of that support for them just emotionally. Like, I'm going to walk with you through this. And there came a point where I had to start writing and I had to step away from the sort of day to day just being with and had to put words on the page or else this
Yeah.
never would have gotten to. And I think that was the hardest thing, was having to navigate, do I take this call? Do I drop everything and run to the courthouse? Do I
Right.
and ethically, morally, that's what troubled me the most. Because I think even though I was constantly reminding them of my role and what I was there for, they didn't see me as a journalist. I think it's shocking to them even now with the book coming out
Right.
that, like, wait, you're a writer? Because they see me as just the guy who they were talking to and the friend and the.
Right.
So that was the hardest thing, was like how to create that kind of boundary in order
Mm.
to like put this thing out into the world.
At what point, Brian, like did you decide, okay, I ethnographed enough. Like it's time to get to the writing. How do you make that call? Is that just like deadline stuff? Or did you come to a point where you felt, okay, I think I have enough to write a book?
I am extremely fortunate in having an absolutely incredible editor. And,
Okay.
most
Who
of the,
was your editor?
her name's Amanda Cook. And she was with me through this whole process. Most of the reporting for the book took place during the pandemic. There were a lot of uncertainties when the pandemic struck. Like, how is this going to work logistically?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of what's in the book wasn't there originally. Some people write a book proposal and they know kind of what is going to be in the
Right.
book. In my case, I had kind of a skeletal frame conceptually, argumentatively, for the book about the working homeless and about the ways that gentrification and kind of the revitalization of our cities is fueling a lot of this insecurity. But in terms of the actual people and the stories, that wasn't there
Mhm.
when I began this process. So my editor, Amanda, we were just constantly on the phone. We talked, I think, like at least once a month during the
Mhm.
reporting process. And the question of when do I have enough, when is it time to start writing, that, to her credit, was really left open ended, and it was just like, we're going to know when we know. And I think there were definitely moments, like some of the more climactic moments in the book, like the mass eviction of
Mhm.
a dozen families at gunpoint from Efficiency Lodge, from this extended stay that I had already been spending months and months at. When that happened, it felt, both in terms of narrative, but also practically, because I wasn't allowed back on the property for a while after that. But
Right.
they hired these guards, and I just wasn't allowed on the property. So, like, that was kind of a natural conclusion.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's sort of case by case,
Right.
but it was all done in collaboration, consultation with my editor, and because I just didn't see the forest for the trees, I was so deep in the weeds with what people were going through and just trying to
Yeah.
capture it, that I needed someone who had more perspective to tell me when it was time to start writing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of seeing the forest through the trees, the title of this book is the last line of chapter, I think 29, and someone says it to you. One of the mothers says it to you. Did you know when she said it? Were you like, boom, title of my book? Or did someone else pick it out from a draft or something?
I could not come up with a title for this book. The working title for most of the time I was working on this book was The New American Homeless. That was the name of the magazine story that I wrote, and
Got it.
but we always knew that wasn't going to be the title that ended up,
Hmm.
um and so the whole time I was working at, like, in the back of my head, I was thinking, what is this thing going to be called? And it was only when I was actually writing that chapter, so at the very end of like the writing process,
Got it.
that I was actually like brainstorming the ideas for the chapter with my wife, and I had that quote in my notes, and I said it out loud, and I was like, I wonder if that could work as the title of the book. And it
Mm,
seemed to
hmm.
capture so much of what the book is
Hmm.
doing. And the
Hmm.
fact that it's in the voice of one of the people in the book is really important, because like it's not me imposing something
Hmm.
on the story. This is
Hmm.
just her say there's no place for us. And I think that
Yeah.
works existentially as well as in just kind of material terms.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to just point out for listeners and ask you about is that in the five families you follow, first of all, they're all families. So there's children involved in every single case. And also, they're all Black. And I'm wondering if you thought at all about including people who didn't have children, including people who weren't Black, like how important of sort of like a quote unquote diversity of representation. Were you thinking about that at all, or were you focused on it in a different way?
Yeah, I think initially when I first began this project, I did have this ideal of having, you know, the white working class family or individual
Mhm.
alongside, some, people of color, and just, yeah, to get at some of that diversity, single people. Um, Here in Atlanta, there are a lot of trans youth and individuals who are experiencing homelessness, LGBT, so getting some of that diversity. In terms of race, it also happens to be the case that in Atlanta, which is no longer majority Black, 93% of the families experiencing homelessness in Atlanta, the cradle of the civil rights movement, are Black. So, in one way, it would have been forced to like
Yeah.
find the one white family
Right.
somewhere
Right.
off in the suburbs somewhere and just latch onto them because they're white and because I need that kind of diverse. I mean, the fact that all five families are Black is actually true to the reality of homelessness in Atlanta.
Right.
Um, but also the desire for to like check these different demographic boxes ran up against the much more important need to have people again who there is a rapport with, who like they're willing to allow me in. And there were people throughout this process. There was a white woman who I followed for several weeks. Like we went out for lunch many times, and she told me her story. And she was a gig worker living in her car. And again, she was one of those people. Like she just had so much she was dealing with that
Hmm.
it didn't work out for us to continue. But yeah, that I think it's really important, though, that this isn't just a question of demographics. It's also so often the history and the story of homelessness in America is told in this kind of colorblind way, or like
Yeah.
the Wikipedia version of homelessness in America is really a white story. It's a story that
Yeah.
begins in the colonial period and runs through the Depression and Jacob Riis's, great army of tramps going throughout the country. And these are mostly white men. And there's a really important moment in the book where Natalia, she starts reading some of the history of housing and displacement and dispossession in America, beginning with Reconstruction and sort of the post-emancipation period. And I began to wonder, like, and I hope readers will latch onto that too, that what if we told a story about housing insecurity and homelessness in America that began not with that great army of tramps during the
Right.
Depression, but that began with 4 million recently emancipated, formerly enslaved human beings who were systematically deprived of land and forced
Right.
into an economy of rent and debt and precarity. what how would that change our very idea of homelessness and housing insecurity in America? Because this didn't just emerge over the last few years. So, like
Right.
the racialized dimension of this is actually super important, I think, to what the book is trying to
Yeah.
do.
Brian, how open are you to me telling you what your next book should be?
I am very open to that because I have no idea what my next book will be.
Okay, I have your next book for you. I need you to write the expose on Blackstone
Mm.
because they're my enemies and they show up in this book. For people who don't know, Blackstone is like a big, what are they, like a hedge fund or something? I don't know. They're like a big
Private equity
money
firm.
company.
Yes.
Private equity.
Private
Something
equity
awful.
giant. Yes.
But they show up in this book like, surprise, we've bought up all the efficiency lodges and we're making them even worse. And I feel like they do that for everything. And so I need you to dig in there and write all about it because I haven't read that book and I need it.
So as much as I would love to get a book deal based on this suggestion, I actually just read in galley form an incredible book by a reporter named Megan Greenwell called Bad Company. And it's about the rise of private equity. It's not just Blackstone. Okay. I think it's important that it isn't just like it's all these other private equity firms, but it's about how private equity is just taken over our lives in this country. And it's an incredible book. And so now you have to give me a different idea for a book.
Okay, well, I'll think about it. I only come up with these brilliant ideas every once in a while. Okay. But also you could do it different because you could do like a deep dive like into, like it could be like just the Blackstone. And, you could expand out like this is how other companies are doing it, but like, the empire of pain, but of Blackstone. Anyways,
yes,
I'm here to spitball with you.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I have to ask you about how you write because we're definitely running out of time, but how do you write? How many hours a day? How often? Music or no? Snacks and beverages, rituals. Set the scene.
I have two kids, two boys, and when I began the book, Elliot, my youngest son, was 2 years old, and so having young kids in the house definitely creates certain limitations for writing. So the only way I was able to get this book done was I had always told myself that I wasn't the type of person who could wake up really early. I needed a certain number of hours of sleep every night, stay up really late, but I ended up waking up every morning at like 4 o'clock, 4:15, 4:30 for months and months and months. And it ended up being this really magical time where for, 3 hours before the kids wake up and I just have this kind of quiet. And so it became a really beautiful and kind of magical space for me. And definitely like the most productive space. Lots of coffee, just the boring, predictable stuff that all writers, I guess, need. Yes, snacks. And yeah.
Which ones? Which snacks?
It's funny because I don't know if other parents do this, but I would never like buy snacks for myself because that was too explicit and indulgent.
Yeah.
So it was always like the Annie's cheddar bunnies that I end up just like ravaging. Yeah. And it's always in the afternoon.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We love a cheddar. I am a goldfish person myself, but I respect the cheddar bunny. It's fine. It's a fine second place. There's two things we have to talk about that we said we would. One is solutions or like hope. I don't know if you've got a lot on that, but if you've got anything on that, I think we'll take it now.
I think one of the most frustrating things in reading about homelessness going into this was so often the writer leaves you with this kind of like, well, who's to say both what caused this and who's to say what can end it? This kind of like vague sense of, well, getting people into homes, but they also need rehab. They also need mental health services. And, that's true. Like people do have needs and those needs need to be met. But I want to be super clear that the reason this catastrophe is spiraling in this country and continues to spiral is because housing has been treated as an asset class, an investment vehicle, a commodity that the few people who are lucky enough to own property are going to profit from the many, many, many more who are in desperate need of a place to live. Like fundamentally, that is why we have a homelessness crisis in this country. And there are other places, other countries where housing is treated as just a basic human necessity, like
Right.
healthcare or education, and it's funded
Two other
accordingly.
things we don't really have
Two
here.
other things we don't have.
So
I mean, we do have private. We do have public schools because we said
yeah,
we're not going to leave K through 12 education to the
right,
whims of profiteers, like
right,
and
right, right.
private schools. Like we're going to make sure that every kid has access to education. And for some reason, we haven't done that with having a home, which is so
Mm-hmm.
basic to people's
Yeah.
stability and survival. So fundamentally, there has to be an expansion, a radical expansion in our moral and political imagination that is not content any longer with just nibbling around the edges. And, going back to that drastic kind of narrowing of the problem, the
Mm-hmm.
population experiencing homelessness that we were talking about with regard to Reagan and has continued into the present, we've narrowed the problem and then we come up with solutions and convince ourselves that the solutions will be adequate because the problem itself has been so drastically limited and narrowed. But
Right.
when you widen the scope and you confront the true reality and the magnitude and severity of this precarity, we then have to come up with like a much more imaginative approach. And ultimately, my hope lies in social housing. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know if there's time to say
Yeah.
what
Go
that
ahead and
is.
just say what that is.
Uh, so social housing is basically if public housing in America hadn't been allowed to fail, hadn't been set up to fail, if there hadn't been this
Yeah.
engineered neglect that turned public housing into the stigmatized, deteriorated place to live, that's what social housing is. Social housing, it exists in other countries like Vienna, in Austria. Vienna is kind of the paradigmatic site of social housing where it's been really, really successful. But Finland was, in effect, able to end homelessness by building social housing, which is like housing for people across the income scale. It's not just for the poorest of the poor, it's where middle class people can live as well without a fear that from one year to the next, your rent is going to skyrocket and you're not going to have a place to live anymore, or where your landlord's going to terminate your lease because it's no longer profitable for them to have you as a tenant and they want to get someone else in or they want to sell the property, where you can live with that kind of safety and stability and knowledge that you're going to have a place to live from one year to the next. That's what social housing is. And that's what public housing was at one point, and that's what it could be again, but it will require a truly massive public investment in people having homes in this country.
What's the difference between social housing and public housing?
I mean, in some ways, it's public housing rebranded. I mean, public
Okay.
housing has become so stigmatized that a lot of people just stop listening when you say public housing.
I see.
So,
Okay.
but social housing is also what it's called in other countries where it has taken off.
Got it. Okay. The other thing I wanted to get to, which is about you actually, and about the Trump administration and DEI. You had a book event canceled because of DEI related issues, I guess, right? And I guess, first of all, what the fuck? And second of all, did you ever think as a white guy you were going to be a DEI target? I mean, it feels like DEI means anything now. So I'm just really curious about what happened. Tell people what happened to your book event. And I mean, whoa.
Yeah. So I was scheduled to launch the book at the Carter Library, the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library here in Atlanta, where um, it's the place in Atlanta where many, many, many book events have happened over the years. It's kind of yeah, it's a wonderful place. And the bookstore, Acapella Books, that was facilitating that event, they've worked with them for years and years, and it's been on the books for months. And in February, my publicist got a call that the event was canceled, and we would have to find a different venue. The bookstore was shocked. We were shocked. We weren't given a lot of information. And then it was revealed that two other book events, one having to do with the civil rights movement, the other having to do with climate change, was also canceled. And other events on ostensibly less threatening topics, more innocuous topics, were allowed to continue. Um, and yeah, it was demoralizing. It was discouraging. And we don't know whether this was the library, the Carter Library, preemptively canceling something because they didn't want to rock the boat, or if there was a directive from the National Archives, which oversees all the presidential libraries, saying this event will not continue. But, once I realized the other books that the other book events that had been canceled, I felt like I was in good company. And I guess I feel like, if a book about housing insecurity and homelessness is now deemed subversive or threatening, it just underscores the urgency of having that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry that happened to you. That sucks. Did you find a new place for your book event?
Yeah, we did. It's going to be my local library, which I'm really excited about. And yeah.
Okay, good. What's a word you could never spell correctly on the first try?
Bureau. Like the Bureau
of Investigation.
Yeah, I and I had a hard time saying it even for many years.
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
For people who love There Is No Place for Us, what are some other books you'd recommend to them that are in conversation with your work?
Ooh, I mean, a book that has meant the world to me, and I was so honored that she read the book and blurbed it, is Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's Random Family.
Mm-hmm.
That book has, was was crucial for me. Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Catherine Boo, Andrea Elliott's Invisible Child, Matthew Desmond's Evicted. There's Roxana Asgharian's We Were Once a Family.
She's the one who put your book on my radar. She's the one who's like, have you read this? Have you heard of this? I was like, no. She's like, feels like you.
Yeah.
I immediately was like, it is me.
Yeah, these are all writers and journalists, researchers who have narrative ambition and writerly ambition, but who are also deeply connected to a kind of moral and political sensibility. And for me, that's really important, that combination.
Can I also throw out Rough Sleepers? Did you read that?
Tracy Kidder, yes, I thought that was really good too. Yes, that was beautiful.
I mean, that's like more literally in conversation because it's about homelessness and it's about people who sleep on the street, and a doctor who sort of takes care, who's sort of changed his life goals into helping take care of and giving healthcare to people who sleep on the street, aka rough sleepers.
For sure.
Last one. If you could have any person, dead or alive, read this book, who would you want it to be?
That's really hard. This is going to sound a little trite, I think, but my initial impulse is to name someone in a position of power. Not necessarily Donald Trump because he doesn't read, but one of his lieutenants, someone who can really make a difference with these issues, and who is instrumental right now in like decimating the already shredded safety net that exists even further. But I honestly, I really believe if any of this is going to change, it's going to come not from the top, but from the bottom. And so I just want the people listening to this to read the book. I want people to get so pissed off and shocked and outraged that even people working their asses off in not just one job, but two jobs, like aren't able to have this most basic thing, a roof overhead in this country, the wealthiest country on earth. I want them to read it, and I want them to be so angry that they start caring about their neighbors who are experiencing this and demanding of anyone around them who's in any position to affect policy change, to demand that they take this seriously. That's who I want to read this, and I know that maybe can sound precious, but that's the truth.
I love it. It's a great answer. Okay, everybody, you have your marching orders. Go get the book and then call all the people that you need to call. I will say, since I finished this book, I live in Los Angeles, which, as you mentioned, is, homelessness is not only is a huge issue here, but it's a huge topic of conversation in California and in Los Angeles. And I haven't been able to drive through the city in the same way. Like it's changed so much of how I'm thinking and moving through my own personal life. So I can definitely, highly recommend this book to listeners. And I think, like you said, I agree. I think any change is going to come from the people saying, like, this is fucking ridiculous, which it is. Everybody, you can get your copy of There Is No Place for Us wherever you get your books. I know there is an audiobook. Do you read it?
The incredible Dion Graham reads.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I read the book off the page. I saw the audiobook, but I was like, this is the kind of book I need to be alone with in my bathtub, in a dark room.
I just heard a sample and
is it amazing?
It's amazing. I'm so grateful that he did this.
He's so good.
He's so good.
I got to meet him and I was such a fangirl, and he was sort of like, okay. Weird.
And he's such a good person too. Yeah.
He's such a nice guy. Well, okay. So if you were on the fence about if you should read it off the page or audio, now you have all the information you need, probably both. Brian, thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure.
Oh, Tracy, thank you so much.
And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. All right, y'all, that does it for us today. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you again to Brian Goldstone for joining the podcast. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Mary Coates and Penny Simon for helping to make this conversation possible. Remember, our book club pick this month is Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton, which we will discuss on Wednesday, April 30th with Tiana Clark. If you love this podcast and you want inside access to it, head to patreon.com/thestacks to join the Stacks Pack and check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. Make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok, and check out our website at thestackspodcast.com. Today's episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Megan Caballero and Waikia Freelo. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tigirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.